Hey everybody, and welcome to Now Let's Be Honest About Movies. My name is David Tate, and this is part 8 of our Lives of the Apostles series, where we are walking through the lives of the 12 apostles in 3 different ways. First, we're briefly talking about their fictional storylines in the TV show The Chosen. Then we move on to what we know about their lives from the text of Scripture. And then thirdly, we talk about what we might or might not know about their lives from the early traditions that developed in the early years of the church. Right? And so that's basically the whole structure of this. And so far, we have talked about 4 disciples. We have talked about Simon Peter. We've talked about his brother Andrew, and then we've talked about the sons of Zebedee, James and John. Today we're talking about our 5th disciple, our 5th apostle, and this is Philip, who is introduced in season 2 of The Chosen, and who I actually had a very good but tough time studying. There's a lot of stuff that's very difficult to research when it comes to Philip, for reasons I'll explain throughout this video. But I actually really enjoyed it because I enjoy whenever I come across something that's difficult because it's just kind of fun. But I'm really just creating these videos just so that we can have a resource that you can go to just know exhaustively what we know about these apostles. And also I'm hoping that these will bless you in a way that isn't just educational and it isn't just informative, but ultimately will draw you closer into a relationship with God, right? I think that we can learn a lot from these apostles because these are the people who knew Jesus most closely. And so I want us to be able to interact with these people and we can learn from their lives the faithfulness that we need to draw close to Jesus ourselves. So I don't want this to be just purely informational. I don't want it to be purely scholastic. There's a lot of scholarship involved with it, but I don't want it to be just that. I want it to ultimately draw us close to God, and if it's not doing that, then I don't want to make these videos. So I pray that we will have that heart about it, and that's what I'm going to do before we start. I'm going to actually pray for us so that we can actually try to go into this with the right mindset. But before we do that, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you know when other videos like this come out, and then be sure to comment below and just interact with me because I usually go back and I try to respond or interact with every single comment y'all leave because I really like getting to know y'all. I actually want to have a community here that gets to know one another, and our main goal is growing in Christ. And so be sure to comment, even if you comment multiple times throughout this. And then share this video with your friends, family, strangers, whoever. Share this so that we can grow this community and we can grow this channel so that more people can learn about the apostles and then ultimately learn about our Savior and grow closer to Him. So be sure to do that. I'm going to move on now and we're going to actually get to the video. I'm going to pray for us and then we're going to start talking about Philip according to The Chosen. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us the freedom to gather here today. There's so many people who don't have that freedom, so we want to thank you first and foremost that you have allowed us to have that we can just spend time on YouTube, just learning about you and learning about what you've done through these chosen servants that you called your apostles. I pray that your Spirit will be present with us as we go about this study, and that we won't just be gaining information, but that we will be gaining passion for you, and that through this study, our desire for you will increase more and more and more, so that we don't just take this information for ourselves, but we actually take it beyond where we are at right now to go share it with the world, so that they too can come to know you. Let us use this to expand your kingdom, God. That is the main thing that the apostles wanted to do. So let us follow in their footsteps. We love you, God. We thank you so much for everything you have done, you are doing, and you will do. And we pray that we will be part of the solution that this world so desperately needs. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, let's get started by talking about Philip according to The Chosen. We are first introduced to Philip when he comes across Peter, James, John, and Thomas as he's strolling through the Bashan at the beginning of Season 2, Episode 2. They ask him what he wants, to which he lists 3 things: for the Romans to leave, for a pretty wife, and for a fattened goose. He comes across as playful and witty, certainly the most quotable of the disciples so far, and perhaps a bit snarky, immediately arousing Simon's suspicions. Philip tells them that he is incapable of telling them what his business is, but informs them that he is a friend of Andrew. We learn that Andrew and Philip knew each other from their shared time of following John the Baptizer. Back at the camp, Philip gets to meet some of the other disciples, at which point he gets to demonstrate some of the wisdom he picked up during his time following John. He quickly picks up on Simon's animosity towards Matthew and decides to take the former tax collector under his wing. The two of them go for a walk to gather some firewood, where Philip begins asking Matthew about his past and the situation with Simon. He tells Matthew that people will always try to define them by their past, but they need to constantly bring to mind the fact that they are different because of the Messiah. When Matthew begins to get frustrated by some of Philip's riddles, as Matthew calls them, Philip apologizes and assures Matthew that he is confident Matthew will probably catch on quicker than the rest. Matthew begins to voice how he feels like an outcast, and Philip tells him that, having followed the baptizer for a few years, he can certainly relate. Later that day, Philip teaches Matthew how to strip wood, allowing them to talk more about what it means to be called by Jesus. Philip even begins to help Matthew out in the social arena, attempting to teach him some basic jokes to help him relate to people better. Later that night, Philip finally gets to meet Jesus. They each report having a message for one another, and just as Jesus says, "Follow me," Philip says, "I will." Jesus is glad to have Philip amongst their group, since Philip is the most experienced of his followers. They sit around a fire and chat for a bit, where Philip is continually astounded by Jesus' brazen actions, many of which surpass even those of the baptizer. Before going to bed, Philip asks Jesus if he can visit a friend while they pass through Caesarea Philippi. Jesus assures him that they will make the time. On the way to Caesarea Philippi, Philip is approached by Matthew, who feels like his work as a tax collector has put him behind the other men in regard to Torah study. He asks Philip for help, and Philip says that he would be glad to. Once they reach the city, Philip goes to his friend Nathanael's house. After knocking for a while, Philip ends up crawling through the window, where he finds a drunken Nathanael passed out on his bed. He learns of some unfortunate life circumstances Nathanael has been facing lately, which ultimately leads Philip to tell him about the new guy he's been following, someone who's going to cause a lot more trouble than the baptizer ever did. He tells Nathanael that this new man is the one of whom Moses and the prophets foretold would come, but Nathanael doesn't believe him once Philip announces he is from Nazareth. In response, Philip simply tells him to come and see. Sure enough, Nathanael comes and sees, and Philip gets to watch as, from the moment his friend meets Jesus, he becomes convinced that he has met the Son of God. Simon and Andrew rush in to announce that people are waiting for Jesus in Syria, and so they depart to make their way there. When they arrive in Syria, Philip begins to teach Matthew some scripture. As they walk past a line of people seeking to be healed by Jesus, he teaches Matthew Psalm 139:8. "If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." He says that Matthew needs to grasp this statement if he is to make any meaningful study of Torah. He and Matthew continue to discuss some basic principles of Bible study, and you can tell that they really are beginning to form a bond and that Matthew is finally beginning to open up. As the evening progresses, the group begins to discuss various expectations about the Messiah, and Philip comes across as the most well-developed theologically speaking. All the others seem to have various expectations regarding who the Messiah would be and what he would do, but Philip grasps that there are some things that remain yet a mystery. When Mary Magdalene says that Jesus doesn't need them to be holy, but that they can't be holy apart from him, Philip is blown away by her profound insight. Later on, as the group is traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, Philip is walking with Jesus, Andrew, and Simon whenever they receive a surprise visit from John the Baptist, who jumps out at them from behind a bush. After reuniting, the group returns to the campsite, where they encounter a demon-possessed man attacking the group. Jesus casts the demon out, and the group is introduced to a new disciple, Simon the Zealot. A little while later, the group is walking through the grain fields on a Sabbath, and everyone stops in their tracks when they catch Simon, not the Zealot, eating grain. Philip explains to Matthew that the oral law forbids such an action on the Sabbath. However, when Jesus gives them permission to eat, they are all quick to comply, causing a stir between Jesus and the local religious leaders. When the group returns to Galilee and Jesus is taken into custody by the Romans, Philip is one of the calmest amongst the group, explaining that he has had practice with situations like this after having spent so much time with John the Baptist. When Andrew starts freaking out and leaves to go find Jesus, Philip calmly volunteers to accompany Andrew to try to calm him down. The two go to the nearby town of Jotapata, where they encounter two people that Andrew recognizes, an Egyptian woman named Tamar and her formerly paralyzed friend, whom Jesus had healed. When Andrew confronts them about their preaching, Philip wisely suggests that they find a more private location to speak. After searching around for Jesus for a while, Philip returns to Andrew and the rest, suggesting that they head back to their campsite. A few days later, the disciples are busy preparing for Jesus' big sermon, Jesus having returned safely to the campsite the very same night that he had been taken into custody. Philip and Andrew are still working through their sorrow over John's arrest, but Philip manages to be a peacemaker amongst the group as tensions continue to rise in preparation for the big day. When the day finally arrives, Philip helps direct the crowds before heading backstage to stand excitedly with the rest as Jesus ascends the steps to give his Sermon on the Mount. Okay, and now that we've talked about Philip according to The Chosen, it's time to move to my favorite part of these videos, where we get to talk about the Apostle Philip according to the text of Scripture itself. Philip according to the Bible. This is always my favorite part of these videos because I am a Bible nerd. I love diving deep into the Bible, and so while I do enjoy talking about The Chosen, and while I do enjoy talking about tradition, Scripture is just a thing I'm passionate about, and so this is always my favorite section of any of these videos. I love diving into the text of Scripture, and I'm really excited for this part. We're going to start off by talking about Philip's biographical information, because this is where we're going to just get to know basically who this guy is, and then we'll start moving into his story and his character and all that stuff, and just basically his life biography. But right now, let's just talk about the basic key info that we need about Philip. First and foremost, his name is Philip. This comes from the Greek Philippos, which means horse-loving or fond of horses. I do not know why he was named this, but he was. And what's interesting about Philip is that he is one of two of the apostles who we only know his Greek name. We do not actually know Philip's Hebrew name. He obviously is an Israelite. He is a Hebrew, but we don't know his Hebrew name. Philip and Andrew are the only two of the 12 that we do not know their Hebrew names. Andrew is also a Greek name, and we talked about that in the video we did on Andrew. But Philip, same thing. We don't know his Hebrew name. And so what I thought I'd do is I would quote some people because, I don't want you to think that I'm this credible person. I'm just going to quote to you other people who kind of give their proposals of why we don't have their names, right? Their Hebrew name. And so I'm going to start with John MacArthur, good old Johnny Mac. And he says this in his book, 12 Ordinary Men. He proposes that perhaps Philip came from a family of Hellenistic Jews. Custom would have dictated that he have a Hebrew name as well, but for whatever reason, he seems to have used his Greek name exclusively. So we know him only as Philip. So from John MacArthur's perspective, maybe Philip actually came from a family of Hellenistic Jews. Hellenistic just means that they've had the Greek influence, right? So maybe they weren't as pious of Jews as, say, like the Pharisees or something like that. They actually allowed some of the Greek influence in their lives, and so maybe Philip just went by his Greek name in general, and that's why. But Richard Bauckham, in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which I've recommended to you many times in these videos, he actually says this: it could be that Philip and Andrew also bore Semitic names that were common, and so were usually known by their more distinctive Greek names. Philip is rather uncommon. It's the 61st in order of popularity with only 6 known occurrences. And Andrew is very uncommon with 3 occurrences only. And so what Richard Bauckham is suggesting is that maybe the reason why Philip and Andrew were known by their Greek names is because maybe they had Hebrew names that were very, very common. We see this with other people in the 12. In the group of the 12, we have 2 Simons, we have 2 Jameses, and we have 2 Judases. And that's because those were some of the most common names at that time period. We have Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot. We've got Big James. We've got Little James, right? And then we have Judas Iscariot and Judas not Iscariot. And usually Judas not Iscariot, he'll either be called Jude or he'll be called Thaddeus. And we'll talk about that when we get to his video. But it's very well possible that maybe Andrew and Philip also had very common names. And so rather than just giving them names like that, like there's different ways that Jewish people would call themselves. They would be called by their patronymic, and that was basically, if you call James the son of Zebedee, that means it's a patronymic because he's being called by the name of his father. James, son of Zebedee. That's how he's being identified as James. But then there are different ways to refer to them, and one way you could do this was by just calling them by their Greek name. Simon is a Hebrew name. Peter is Greek, right? So Simon Peter, that's both his Hebrew and his Greek name side by side. It's very well possible that Andrew and Philip both, they just went by their Greek names because they had very common Hebrew names. Maybe their names were John, James, Simon, something like that. And so rather than calling them by the same name and just getting everybody confused, they're like, we're going to call you Philip because that's a very uncommon name. So those are 2 different possible proposals for why Philip is only known by that Greek name. Either maybe he came from a Hellenistic family, or maybe he just had a very common Hebrew name. But we really ultimately won't know. We don't know, and we'll have no way of knowing until we get to heaven. We can ask him for ourselves. But Philip meant horse-loving and fond of horses, and there are actually 3 different Philips that we encounter in the text of Scripture, and they're all in the New Testament. The first one is Philip the Tetrarch. He's one of the Herods. His name is Herod Philip II. And if you know anything about the power structures at that time period, Herod was a very common name in this family. It was like Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip II. There are all these Herods. But Philip was one of these, and he was the son of Herod the Great and Cleopatra of Jerusalem, right? So Herod the Great, this is the guy who met the wise men at Jesus' birth, and the one who ended up ordering that all the infants in Bethlehem and the surrounding regions be murdered because he was a power-hungry tyrant who did not want to deal with this new king of the Jews, this Messiah figure, right? And so Herod the Great, very bad guy. Herod Philip, or Philip, the guy I'm talking about right now, he was his son. And this guy is actually pretty popular in Scripture because we encounter Jesus and his disciples going to a place called Caesarea Philippi, which was named after this Philip the Tetrarch. And it was named after him because he's the one who rebuilt that city and named it after himself. But then you also might know him because his wife is the one who ended up leaving him for Herod Antipas. Her name is Herodias, right? So Herod Antipas, Herodias. They get married. This is what John the Baptist is calling out that ultimately leads to his beheading and his death because he gets arrested because he's calling out Herod Antipas for marrying his brother's wife. And that ultimately leads to his death. And so Philip, that's who this guy is, right? So that's our first Philip. Our second Philip is a guy named Philip the Evangelist, one of the 7 deacons of the early Jerusalem church who performed a bunch of miracles in Samaria. You'll recognize this guy from the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, right? Where this guy named Philip is walking around. He encounters this Ethiopian eunuch reading the scroll of Isaiah, and he explains it to him, and he baptizes the guy, and then he's caught up, and he goes to Samaria. That's Philip the Evangelist, and he's our second Philip in the New Testament. Our third Philip is Philip the Apostle, and that's the person that we are studying today. And the reason why I spent so much time explaining this is because the last 2 Philips are going to produce a little bit of a problem for us in this study. Because Philip the Evangelist and Philip the Apostle get confused with one another very early on in church tradition. By the 2nd century, people are already getting these 2 people confused because they're both called Philip and they're both very prominent leaders in the early church. And so it's going to make it very difficult to figure out which tradition applies to which because it seems like the early church got very confused on who's who. And so that's going to make this particular study a little bit more difficult than some of the others just because we won't necessarily know if the traditions are talking about Philip or if they're talking about Philip the Apostle or Philip the Evangelist. They're 2 separate people. But that ultimately will come into play whenever we get to the end of this video when we talk about Philip according to tradition. For right now, we're talking about Philip according to the Bible, and within the text of Scripture, these are actually pretty clear-cut. We know which one's Philip the Apostle, Philip the Evangelist. We should be good to go there. It's mainly when we get to traditions that this is going to be difficult. So there's his name, Philip. Philippos, horse-loving or fond of horses. Let's move on a little bit, and we got a big chunk of stuff right here with a bunch of question marks, and that's because we really just don't know that much about Philip. He's not mentioned barely at all in the Synoptic Gospels. He's literally only in the list of the 12 apostles, and the only things we do know about him come from the Gospel of John, and we learn a few things, but we don't know if he had any nicknames. I mean, it seems like Philip probably was his nickname. We just don't know his actual name, right? Because Philip would have been his Greek name. We don't know if he had any nicknames. We don't know his father's name. We don't know his mother's name. We don't know his siblings' names. He probably had all of those things, but we don't know them. We don't know if he had a spouse. We have good reason to think that maybe he did not, and we'll talk about that when we start talking about his age. But we just don't know. We have no way of knowing any of these things, and if we did, that'd be really cool because it would flesh out the character and would allow us to know a little bit. We'd be able to know this guy a little bit more intimately, but we just don't have this information. And so, let's move on. His hometown is a place called Bethsaida, and we learned this from John chapter 1, verse 44, where we read that Philip was from the town of Simon and Andrew, right? Simon and Andrew, these are the sons of John or sons of Jonah. They came from a place called Bethsaida, and eventually they moved to a place called Capernaum. Well, it seems like they grew up alongside Philip when they were in their town of Bethsaida. So we don't know whether or not Philip moved to Capernaum with them or anything, but it does seem like they at least grew up in the same place. And this means, this is kind of cool, this means that he probably grew up going to the same school and attending the same synagogue as Simon and Andrew. They probably knew each other from childhood. And so this is kind of cool when it comes to fleshing out the dynamics between the various apostles. And you do see this a little bit in The Chosen, right? In The Chosen, we have Philip and Andrew both being disciples of John the Baptist prior to following Jesus, and so that's how they know each other. But realistically, it might have gone even further than that. And because Simon, Andrew, and Philip all grew up in Bethsaida, they probably grew up going to the same school. They probably learned the scriptures alongside one another. And so they probably knew each other from childhood, spread out a little bit later on. Maybe Simon and Andrew moved to Capernaum to become fishermen, stuff like that. Philip stayed behind. But now they're being reunited. And the reason we say this is because Bethsaida was a fairly small town, so it's more than likely that all the kids there would have gone to the same school. But they probably knew each other from childhood. They were childhood friends, and they eventually get together. That's kind of neat, and it's just kind of interesting to think about the fact that maybe these disciples were a little bit more familiar with one another than we normally would think. They weren't just a bunch of random people. Some of them had a little bit of close personal ties. We talked about with James and John, how they might have possibly been cousins of Jesus. We don't know that for sure, and you can go look at those videos if you want to see exactly why we might think that. But it seems like there might have been these personal ties with all these people, and so that's kind of neat. And this also could explain why Philip and Andrew are often seen alongside one another, specifically in the Gospel of John. I mean, in the list of the 12, they're usually right next to each other. Usually Andrew's kind of near the end, and then Philip's right in number 5. I mean, like Andrew's number 4 and Philip's number 5. Andrew's at the end of the first list. But in the Gospel of John specifically, we see Andrew and Philip constantly like right next to one another. And so it seems like they might have had some sort of relationship, maybe in the sense that Simon, we know, seems to have been the oldest of the disciples. So maybe Andrew and Philip were around the same age, and maybe that's why they would have a special bond. Once again, this is all kind of goes into speculation, but it's kind of cool how little details in the Gospels might suggest stuff like that to us, right? We don't want to run with this. We don't want to tell everybody that this is solid fact, but we do get to start kind of developing a mental image, right? For some reason, Philip and Andrew are always next to one another. They grew up in the same town. It seems like maybe they were around the same age. They grew up together, and there was a friendship there. So that's kind of cool. I just think that's neat. When it comes to his place of residence, so difference between where he was born and where he lived at the time of being called, we don't fully know. It doesn't say. It just says that he was from Bethsaida, the town of Simon and Andrew. And so I would just suggest that maybe he probably just kind of stayed in that same area. I kind of just put this distinction because of Simon and Andrew, how they moved from one place to the other, and so I wanted to clarify that. But with each of these disciples, most of them we don't know where they came from. With Philip, we know he was from Bethsaida. We just don't know where he was living at that time. I would say he probably was living in the same place. They weren't that far from one another. Bethsaida and Capernaum, not that far. And so it seems like he was maybe in the same place. Education, I'd probably put limited, but I put a question mark again because this is something we don't know. When it came to Simon, Andrew, James, and John, we had good reason to think that they had limited education because we have one encounter between between Peter and John with the religious leaders at that time period in the book of Acts, and they call them uneducated common men, which tells us that they probably only had the base level education. It wasn't that they had no education whatsoever, but just that they probably only were in school till like 12 or 13 before moving on to their trade. And since Peter and John are brothers with Andrew and James, we have reason to think that they probably all had the same education and therefore all had limited education. When it comes to Philip, we don't know, but if he grew up in the same town with Simon and Andrew, it's very well possible that he had the same type of education level as them. It's possible that he might have had more. We just don't have any way of knowing, and so for right now, I'm going to tentatively say he had a limited education, and he probably just had the most base level just as they did as well. And this also is because, as we'll see when we talk about the age, I do think that the disciples were younger than we typically present them as in movies and stuff like that. And so in order for them to be that age and still be able to go out and do these things, I would think that they wouldn't have had too high of an education. They wouldn't still be in school. They would have already been in their trade, but they wouldn't be so developed in their trade that they could still abandon it and stuff like that. So for right now, we'll just say that he had a limited education, but ultimately, we do not know. When it comes to his language, we have good reason to think that he spoke Aramaic, but he very likely understood Greek and Hebrew as well, and this is going to be basically the case with almost all of the apostles. The only distinction I can think of off the top of my head is probably Matthew. With Matthew, he might have actually been a little bit more fluent in a bunch of the languages. But with Philip, at least, Aramaic was the common language of that time period for Jews. But since he was living up in Galilee, he would have had to be familiar with Greek because there were a lot of Gentiles in that area and a lot of Hellenistic Jews. And since his name is Philip, which is a Greek name, we have good reason to think that he probably understood Greek. That'd be kind of weird. But then he also probably knew some Hebrew because you had to be familiar with biblical Hebrew in order to go about any meaningful study of Torah. Torah being the first 5 books of the Bible, and then also the rest of the Old Testament. You had to know biblical Hebrew and be familiar with it to go through that. And so probably primarily Aramaic, maybe a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Hebrew. That seems to be the case with most of the apostles. When it comes to his occupation, this is an interesting one. He might have been a fisherman. We don't know, but this comes from John chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. And honestly, I would probably lean away from this. It's very well possible that he was a fisherman, but I lean away from using this as a defense of that because, as we'll see, it's kind of shaky ground to me. I'm going to quote John MacArthur again from 12 Ordinary Men, but I do think he kind of overstates his case when it comes to Philip here. So he says this: "There's good biblical evidence that Philip, Nathanael, and Thomas were all fishermen from Galilee. Because in John 21, after the resurrection, when the apostles returned to Galilee and Peter said, 'I am going fishing,' the others who were there all answered, 'We're going with you also.' According to John 21, verse 2, that group included Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. The unnamed 2 others were most likely Philip and Andrew, because elsewhere they were always seen in the company of the men who are named in that passage." So I think that John MacArthur kind of overstates his case here when he says there's good biblical evidence to suggest that Philip was a fisherman here. Because first off, Philip is not named in that passage. It just says 2 other disciples, and MacArthur kind of just says, oh, well, Philip and Andrew are the 2 other disciples who are mentioned in the Gospel of John fairly frequently, and so it must have been them. I would lean away from that because to me, I would think that why wouldn't he just say, and Philip and Andrew? To me, I would actually lean towards thinking maybe the 2 other disciples were disciples who had been unnamed so far in the Gospel of John, and so rather than introducing 2 new disciples at the end of his narrative, he just says, and 2 others. I have no way of proving that, but I'm saying I don't think that we really have good biblical evidence for this. And even if they did go do this, I don't think that suggests that all of these guys were themselves fishermen. As we'll see when we talk about Nathanael or Bartholomew, as we'll see in the next video, hint, hint, whenever we talk about him, we might have actually reason to think that he wasn't a fisherman, specifically because he grew up in Cana, which was nowhere near water. And so I don't necessarily think that that passage suggests that every single person who went fishing was themselves a fisherman. It means that they might have been able to fish, but if you're hanging out with Simon, Andrew, James, and John in Capernaum a lot, you're probably going to learn how to fish at some point. And so I really don't know. I think he is overstating his case here, but it is always possible. It is possible that all the people who are mentioned there were fishermen, and those 2 disciples could have been Andrew and also Philip. But we just have no way of knowing, and so I don't want us to overstate the case there, but it is possible. Bethsaida was on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, and so even without all this, without that passage, it's very well possible he could have been a fisherman just because that's what a lot of people living in that town would have done. But I just don't want to overstate that because I think that we need to be honest with our scholarship there. And I've actually noticed this. I usually like a lot of John MacArthur stuff, but I've noticed that when it comes to the 12 apostles, he kind of does overstate his case just a tad. And we'll talk about that whenever we get to some stuff specifically dealing with Philip's character. But let's move on and let's talk about how old was Philip. This is going to be something that I address in every video, but since we're covering stuff that you've already heard in the other videos, I'm going to go through it a lot more quickly, and with each video, I'll just be able to go through it quicker and quicker because you're already going to know this information. But I'm still going to address it because I want each video to be exhaustive to where somebody can watch this and not have to go watch all the other videos. I mean, I'm going to suggest you go watch them if you want greater details, but for right now, I'm just giving you the base information. How old was Philip? Short answer, we do not know. This is purely speculation. This whole slide is purely speculation, but I think it's based off of solid evidence from Scripture and from traditions of Judaism around that time period, right? And so, first and foremost, we have to ask how old were the disciples in general, and then from that, we can learn about Philip's age, because really, we don't know enough about Philip to make a separate case for him. With some of the disciples, we had different things, like Simon Peter, we had reason to think he was probably the oldest one. With the Apostle John, we had reason to think he was the youngest from different evidence. Philip, he's going to kind of be the average age of all of them. Jesus was around 30 years old when he began his ministry, and that was the typical age for a rabbi at that time period. Students were usually younger than the rabbis. Jesus refers to them as little children, and so therefore we have good reason to think that the disciples were at least younger than 30 at the time that Jesus began his ministry. So our top age would be 29. Education ended between ages 12 to 15, and some disciples were already practicing their trades, and so this would suggest to us that the bottom age it could be is 13 or so, right? Because it seems like the youngest one was the Apostle John, and he was already a fisherman at the time Jesus called him, and so he's already out of school, so let's say 13 is the youngest age they could have been, right? So now we're 13 to 29. The disciples seem to be somewhere in there, which is reinforced by the fact that Jesus does call them little children. He could just be using that metaphorically regarding to their spiritual lives. But according to that, like the custom at that time period, disciples would be younger than the rabbis. And it also makes sense that somebody who was an older man couldn't just give up everything and follow Jesus, right? I mean, he had too many responsibilities for that. Like he wouldn't just be able to literally drop everything. So a young person who just got out of school, he would actually still have that flexibility to follow a rabbi. As far as we know, Simon was the only one married at that time, and at the beginning of Jesus' ministry specifically, because this happens very early on in Jesus' ministry, we have Jesus healing Simon's mother-in-law. And so we know that by the beginning of Jesus' ministry, Simon was married, but we never have any other spouse of an apostle being mentioned in the text of the Gospels, or really the text of Scripture for that matter. Other than like James, the brother of Jesus, I believe, is married, and I think that's mentioned later on in the epistles. But when it comes to the 12 apostles, the only one we know for a fact was married was Simon Peter, and that doesn't mean the others weren't, but we don't have evidence for it, and so that might suggest to us that once again, Simon was the oldest one, and if the average age of marriage was 18, that means that most of these guys would have probably been under 17 at the time they began following Jesus, right? They could have gotten married later on, but it seems like Simon was the only one who was married, and so now we're between ages 13 to 17. As far as we know, by the third year of Jesus' ministry, Simon was the only one who had to pay the temple tax, which began at age 20. And so that would suggest to us that, 3 years later, Simon, he is over 20, and so he has to pay the temple tax. Jesus has to pay the temple tax. That's what this passage right here is talking about. Some people come up to Simon and they say, hey, do you and your master pay the temple tax? But they don't ask about the other apostles, which would suggest to us once again that by the third year of Jesus' ministry, these guys are under the age of 20. And so that means 19, and then go 3 years earlier, 16. It seems like these guys were probably between the ages of 13 and 16 at the time they began following Jesus, which would put them between 16 and 19 by the time that he actually died, resurrected, and ascended. And so most of the disciples were likely young teenagers at the time they began following Jesus, and Philip was likely also a young teenager between the ages of roughly 14 and 16 at the time he began following Jesus. The reason I said 14 to 16 is because I believe John was probably the youngest, and so bump it up a little year, right? This is purely a guess, right? This is all speculation. I just think it's interesting what we can pick up on when we actually examine the text of Scripture. But it's not a big deal. For all I know, they could have all been 80, but that would have been very odd, and they would have had very long lives until they died as martyrs. But this is just something that I found very interesting, and I think it actually says a lot about how we should treat our youth in the modern day church, because I think that sometimes we kind of undersell their ability, and I think we need to realize that they really can accomplish a lot for God. But let's move on, and let's start talking about Philip in the Gospels. Normally what I would do is I'd start talking about Philip's character, and then we'd start walking through his biography. But I realized that kind of just adds a lot of extra work, because what I'm having to do is I'm having to talk about what his character traits were like by explaining what we learned about him from Scripture, and then I'm doubling back and talking about his story. So what I'm going to do going forward is I'm actually going to talk about their life story in the Gospels, and then as a result of that, we can talk about their character traits, because then we can actually, it just makes a little bit more sense. Now we already know the stories, and we can reflect on it without me having to summarize the story twice. And so this will just probably be a little bit more time efficient as well. So let's start with talking about Philip in the Gospels. And the first thing we have to talk about is his calling. But one thing I want to mention before that is that other than listing him as a member of the 12, the Synoptic Gospels say nothing of Philip. Most of what we know about him comes from the Gospel of John. right? So like I mentioned earlier, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the only time we hear about Philip at all is that he is in the lists. He's in the gospel. He's in the list of the apostles, right? He's fifth in every list, and that's it. He's never mentioned again. Same thing in Acts. He's mentioned, never mentioned again. Anytime you hear Philip after that, it's Philip the Evangelist, which confuses people. The Gospel of John, though, is the one that tells us more about Philip, and so we're going to be spending a lot of the time in the Gospel of John today. So we have to talk about his first encounter and his calling, and this is immediately we run into this problem because there's a little bit of confusion over what's going on here. So either Andrew or Jesus found Philip, and Jesus called him to follow. And I'll explain what I mean by that. What I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to read the passage at hand, and then I'm going to explain to you what all this stuff means right here, because we've got to go into a little bit of Greek. Not that, ultimately, where we land on this is not going to be that important, but I just want to explain it to you just because I want us to understand the story well, right? And so we're going to start in John chapter 1, literally the first chapter of John, and we're going to start in verse 40, and I'm going to read through verse 43. One of the two who heard John the Baptist speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. Right? And so the way that the story is structured so far is that there was Andrew and another disciple who I believe to probably be the Apostle John. They were following John the Baptist. John the Baptist tells them to go follow Jesus. They go meet Jesus, and Andrew gets up, and the first thing he goes and does is he goes and finds his brother Simon. He brings Simon to Jesus. He introduces him. Jesus says, "I'm going to call you Peter." And then in verse 43, we read this. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." So this is where things get a little bit weird, because when the way that the way that the original Greek language is worded in this verse, it makes it very ambiguous as to who is deciding to leave for Galilee, right? Because right here, what I've got highlighted here, this is the original Greek text, right? I'm not going to bother reading all of it for you, but the word at hand right here is ethelesin, right? And this is the third person singular, aorist active indicative of the word thelo, which means to will or desire, right? That's basically, if you want to know what this means, third person, that means like he, she, it. Singular means it's referring to one person, right? So there's this one person who is speaking. Aorist means past tense, basically. I mean, it means a little bit more than that, but generally it means past tense. Active means that he is the person actively doing it. He's not the one receiving the words. He is the one speaking them. Indicative means he is indicating something, right? And so basically there's a person speaking in the past tense, and he is desiring to do something, right? The word thelo means to desire. So somebody is desiring to leave for Galilee. What you'll notice here is that most translations put Jesus here, but that is more of an interpretive understanding of it. The word Jesus doesn't appear till way down here at the end of the verse, and that says, "And Jesus said to him, 'Follow me.'" And so we know for a fact that Jesus is the one saying, "Follow me," but we don't know who it is who decided to leave for Galilee and who it was who found Philip. That's the weird thing. So it really, the NIV, ESV, and most translations will say the next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee, because that is what most scholars come to the consensus on. The NASB, the New American Standard, it says the next day he decided to go to Galilee and he found Philip, but notice that they also capitalize the H here, which tells us that they're still talking about Jesus and they're still interpreting it as Jesus, but they are keeping the text faithful to what the Greek originally says. For me, this is just my translation. The next day he decided to go into Galilee and he found Philip, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me." And that's because my whole translation philosophy is that whenever I translate something, I just want to put as close to what the Greek says as possible and leave the interpretation to the reader, right? And so for me, I'm not going to capitalize the H, regardless of what I think, because I just want the person to figure out what do they think this is trying to say. And so we have to kind of wrestle with this. Who is it who went and found Philip? Ultimately, like I said, this doesn't matter. But I just think it's interesting when it comes to just stuff in Scripture, right? So the person who decided to go to Galilee equals the person who found Philip. We know that for a fact. These are the same person because in Greek, that's one sentence, right? He decided to go into Galilee, and he found Philip. This is Philippon, right? That's the accusative. That means that it is the direct object. He went and found Philip. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." So we have to ask, who is it who decided to go into Galilee? Because this is the person who found Philip. Jesus is introduced afterwards saying, "Follow me." So is it Jesus who is going out and doing this, or is it Andrew? Because Andrew was the last person we talked about in the previous verse, right? The previous verses said this: one of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother, Simon, and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. The next day, he decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me." So we've got to wrestle through this. We got to figure out what this is going for. Like I said, it doesn't matter, but I do want to raise this to you because it does affect how exactly this interplay is going on in the Gospels. And what I'm going to do is I am going to just explain to you the arguments laid out by D.A. Carson in his commentary on the Gospel of John, which is probably my favorite commentary I've ever read on the Gospel of John. It is fantastic. Go buy that book. I think it's in the Pillar Commentary series or something like that. But there's two things that he points out in favor of this being Andrew who actually goes and finds Philip. First and foremost, this gives extra significance to the word first in verse 41. Because back in verse 41, it says that Andrew first found his brother Simon and said to him. So the word first there might seem to imply that he went and found somebody else second, which would make sense if Andrew is the one who goes and finds Philip here. Maybe. A second thing he mentions is that this explains why Jesus is named in the second sentence. Right? So this would explain, if this is Andrew here, it explains why Jesus isn't named until the second sentence way over here. It seems like it would make more sense in Greek for it to say, "and Jesus," like basically how you read it in this, it would make sense, if Jesus was the subject, it would make sense for him to be mentioned earlier on in the Greek. But for some reason it says he here, right? It's just third person singular, it doesn't tell you the subject, and Jesus isn't mentioned till here. And so D.A. Carson, arguing for the Andrew interpretation, he suggests that those are actually two pretty good reasons to think that maybe it's Andrew who found Philip, not necessarily Jesus. But ultimately, this is what D.A. Carson concludes. He says that ultimately this cannot be proved because the evangelist does not actually say that the one who decided to enter Galilee after finding Philip actually brought him to Jesus. If Andrew is the subject, that has to be assumed, an assumption that is natural enough considering how condensed the narrative is, right? So what he's pointing out is that it doesn't say the next day he decided to go into Galilee and found Philip and brought him to Jesus. He says it doesn't say that, so we can't necessarily say that, like, definitively that this is Andrew. But then he continues, but that this view is correct is supported by the fact that everyone else who comes to Jesus in this chapter does so because of someone else's witness. If Andrew is the subject, there are no exceptions. Theologically, the evangelist is reinforcing his theme of the importance of bearing witness. Historically, Jesus does not at this time call any of his fledgling disciples, as he later does according to the accounts in the Synoptic Gospels. Right? And so what he's pointing out there is that every other person who comes to Jesus in John chapter 1 doesn't come because Jesus called them, but they come because somebody else brought them to him, right? So you have John the Baptist telling Andrew and another disciple to go to Jesus. Then Andrew goes and he gets Simon. Then in this interpretation, Andrew goes and gets Philip. Philip goes and gets Nathanael, right? So in that case, every person in the Gospel of John would be coming to Jesus because of an evangelistic effort, right? It's the eyewitness testimony of somebody else sharing that with them. If this is Jesus going to get Philip here, that would be the one exception. So it'd be everybody's going and bringing somebody to Jesus, but for some reason, Jesus specifically goes out of his way to find Philip. So this would make sense given that, one, Andrew had been away from Galilee following John the Baptist, in which case the text is stating that he decided to return to Galilee. So this would explain why he is deciding to go into Galilee. Normally, we interpret this as Jesus wanting to go into Galilee because in chapter 2, he's going to go to a wedding there. But it could be talking about Andrew deciding to go to Galilee because he'd been following John down in Judea for so long. John the Baptist, right? And so that would make sense. And also, early church tradition suggests that Andrew might have been involved with helping John write his gospel, right? We talked about this in our video on Andrew, but we have good reason to think that Andrew was actually involved with John in writing the gospel, and so it would make sense that he is a major player in the early text, right? And so That's possible, right? It is very well possible that Andrew is the one who decided to go into Galilee, and it could be that he found Philip, and that ultimately he brought Philip to Jesus, and Jesus said, "Follow me." That all being said, however, in my own opinion, the story does seem to flow better if Jesus, not Andrew, is the one that the text is referring to. I know that I just gave that huge defense for it being Andrew finding Philip, but ultimately I think the text makes more sense based off of like just how these translations interpret it. I think that makes the most logical sense in the story. I do get the thematic elements that D.A. Carson brings up. I do get how the Greek is kind of confusing there. But to me, the story just makes more sense if we're talking about this being Jesus doing this, because it just flows better, right? The fact that Jesus decided to leave for Galilee, while in the previous passage you had Andrew and the other disciples saying, "Where are you staying?" And so he took them where he was staying, but then he's the one deciding to leave. And Jesus is the active one who is making the big movements. It makes more sense to me that Jesus is the one who decided to leave. He's the one who went and found Philip, and he's the one who said, "Follow me." And this would suggest to us possibly that Philip was likewise following John the Baptist at that time period, since he was in the country of Judea while Jesus and his disciples were heading to Galilee. And so this is where, like in The Chosen, they present Philip and Andrew as both being disciples of John the Baptist. This is where they get that, because right as they're deciding to go into Galilee, whether it's Andrew or Jesus, they're still in Judea, and they're still around the campsite of John the Baptist. And while they're getting ready to leave, he finds Philip, right? And so it might suggest to us that Philip also was a disciple of John the Baptist who was there at that same time period. Jesus says to him, "Follow me," and they leave. So that's basically the long, complicated explanation for who called Philip. In the end, either interpretation seems plausible. It was either Andrew or Jesus who finds him, but ultimately Jesus calls him to follow. And that actually in the Gospel of John is our first example of Jesus saying to somebody, "Follow me." And so that's his first encounter. His first encounter with Jesus is either through Andrew, through his friend Andrew, or through Jesus himself. They come and they say to follow. Now we can go into the Gospels a little bit more, and we can talk about his life as a disciple. And what we'll see right off the bat is that Philip is listed fifth in every list of the 12 found in Scripture. This is something that I've mentioned earlier. But as you'll see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, we have all the 12 apostles listed. We don't have a list of the apostles in the Gospel of John. It's a very different gospel. That's why it's not called a synoptic. But what you'll notice in these lists is that they're not always in the same order. Simon is always first, and then you have it mixed up around here, right? James is third, James is second, James is third, James is third. Andrew is second, Andrew is fourth, Andrew is second, Andrew is fourth. John is first, John is fourth, so it bumps all around, right? All these lists change. But what you'll notice is that it does seem like the apostles were split off into three different groups, because at the head of each group is the same person. Simon is at the head of the first four. Philip is at the head of the second four. And James, son of Alphaeus, or little James, he is at the head of the third group of four. And so while the ones in between are constantly shuffling around and moving, it does seem like maybe there were these distinctions and that there were these leaders in the group. And in this case, Philip might have been the leader of the second group of four. So while he wasn't as prominent as Simon, Andrew, James, and John, he might have been the most prominent of the second group. And I think that's kind of cool. So he did seem to maybe have possibly a leadership position amongst them. We don't know this definitively. We don't actually know why each of these lists listed them in any specific order. Maybe they just had a way of memorizing it, and maybe the way that the mnemonic way they memorized it was they always started with the same person every four or something like that. I don't know. But it might suggest to us that he did have some level of leadership. Like the rest of the 12, Philip would have done these things. He was appointed by Jesus. He traveled with Jesus. He received insight to Jesus' teachings. He was sent out to preach. He baptized people. He performed miracles. He was challenged by Jesus' teachings. He heard the predictions of Jesus' death. He fled at Christ's arrest. He witnessed the resurrected Christ, and he witnessed the ascension. Right? So these are things that all of the rest of the 12 would have done. Obviously, Judas Iscariot would not have witnessed these two events because he would have been dead by that point. Like I said, not looking forward to doing the Judas video. But these are things that Philip would have encountered along with the rest of the 12. This is something that was part of all of their experience. And so while we won't know a whole lot about Philip, we do know at least these things. But let's move on a little bit further and let's talk about some of Philip's key moments in Scripture. First and foremost, we have him finding his friend Nathanael and requesting that he come and see Jesus. This is a passage that we are going to dive very deeply into when we get to our next video on Nathanael. But it's one of my favorite passages because it's so unique and there's so many things to wrestle with. And that's why we're going to have to go really deep in it when we get to Nathanael's video. But this comes from John chapter 1. And I'm going to read verses 43 through 51. Right here I have 43 to 46 because that's where Philip is active and present in the text. But really through 51 is that whole section, and I like to read the whole section. And so this is immediately after Andrew has found Simon, and now we're picking up in the verse I literally started with earlier. The next day Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said to him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under a fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And so, really the majority of this text has to deal with Jesus' interactions with Nathanael. But at the very beginning of this, we have Philip coming to Jesus, and the first thing he does is he goes and finds his friend Nathanael to bring him as well. We see this in The Chosen, Season 2, Episode 2. In that story, we have Philip and Nathanael both being introduced. And the cool thing about the story is that in the same episode Philip's introduced, he goes and he brings another person to Jesus, right? So we already get to see that Philip is a very evangelistically minded person, right? He's like, I met Jesus, I'm going to go proclaim him. That's really cool. But the thing that I love about Philip is the way that he phrases it. Right? He goes to Nathanael and he says, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathanael's like, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" He's kind of prejudiced against the people of Nazareth. We'll talk about that when we get to Nathanael's video. But the way that Philip does it, he doesn't say, he doesn't start defending Jesus. He doesn't start backing off and start getting embarrassed. Instead, he just says, "Come and see." Right? That's such a bold proclamation because he's facing this prejudiced man who apparently does not think anything good can come from this town. And rather than feeling the need to back off and rather than getting embarrassed about who he believes Jesus to be, he boldly invites Nathanael and says, "Come and see for yourself." He is so confident in who Jesus is that he says, "You know what? I don't care about what prejudice you have. I don't care about your bias. Come and see for yourself. I know that he'll prove me true." That's so cool to me. I think that we as Christians need to have that same mindset. I probably should have worn the "Come and See" shirt. I literally have it right here. Literally, look at this. Boom. It's right on my bed. "Come and See" is one of the Chosen's shirts, and I love that shirt because it's got an important message. I think we need to go throughout the world and we need to have that same boldness when it comes to proclaiming Jesus. People are going to be ashamed of Jesus. They're going to be embarrassed of Jesus. They shouldn't be as much nowadays. I mean, the apostles had to go through some severe persecution, but for some reason Christians, we get ashamed and we get embarrassed of God more often. I don't know why. But there's going to be people who oppose us. There are going to be people who do not want anything to do with Jesus, and they are going to bring their false understandings about him to us, and they're going to accuse him of things that he does not need to be accused of. They're going to raise accusations against him that make no logical sense. And typically as Christians, we get embarrassed and we feel the need to defend Jesus. And we feel the need to do everything to be like, "Oh, well, that's not exactly what Jesus said." And we start freaking out and we think that for some reason these people deserve a long, complicated answer. When really I think that Philip's response is key. Come and see. These people can accuse Jesus of whatever. But ultimately, in the end, he's going to prove himself true. And one day, he's going to reign in glory forever and ever. And so maybe we don't need to make it our main point to defend him. We need to let him defend himself. We need to invite them to test and see if what he has said is true. And ultimately, since we are on the side of truth, it will prevail. And so I really like that. I love apologetics. I'm not coming against apologetics. I just think maybe our apologetics have lost their focus. I think we've made it about defending God, whereas specifically in the Bible, it tells us we need to make a defense for the hope that is in us, right? Specifically, why do we believe what we believe? That's what we need to be worried about defending. I don't think we need to defend God as much as we do. I think it's good to be able to, but I think sometimes we just need to let God defend himself. We say, come and see. Test it for yourself. See if what he said is true. Open up the scriptures and prove me wrong. People will say that there's contradictions in the Bible. Prove it. Show me one. If there was a genuine contradiction, okay, let's see. I don't think there is. People will say there's discrepancies. Okay, show me one. People will say that God did evil things. Show me an example, right? Come and see. Let us examine the scriptures. Let us examine all the things around us and let us find to see if what God has said is true. Because I think if we honestly and unbiasedly examine these things, we will see that God is always true and he is always who he claims to be. Can anything good from Nazareth? Yes. Something good can come from Nazareth, Nathaniel. And if you come and see Jesus, you will see that he is from Nazareth and he is good. Come and see. I think that's a great message. I think we need to learn from that. And I've always loved that about Philip. That's one of the reasons why I love that passage so much in the Gospel of John. A second key moment for Philip is being tested by Jesus shortly before the feeding of the 5,000. This is a very interesting story because it explicitly says that Jesus was testing Philip, and you got to wonder why. But this comes from John chapter 6, so this is a few chapters later, which, once again, John chapter 6 is another one. I really just like the Gospel of John a whole lot. It's one of my favorite books of the Bible. I know you're not supposed to have too many favorites, but man, I love it. But John chapter 6, specifically the end of John chapter 6, is like one of the most powerful scenes in all of Scripture to me. But right here, this is the feeding of the 5,000, and we have this miracle being reported in all four Gospels, but we have this encounter between Jesus and Philip only being mentioned in the Gospel of John. I'm going to start in verse 1. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him, because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, Where are we to buy bread, so that these people may eat? And he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to eat a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? Jesus said, Have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So when the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And so once again, notice that Philip and Andrew are mentioned side by side, might suggest some sort of relationship there. But it's such an interesting story because it explicitly says that Jesus was testing Philip. Because Jesus already knew what he was going to do. He already knew there were going to be 5 loaves and 2 fish. He already knew Andrew was going to bring them. He already knew that he was going to multiply the food. But instead, he turns to Philip first and says, What do you think we should do? How do we feed them? And Philip's like, Jesus, I don't know. 200 denarii wouldn't feed all these people. So we see Philip is very practical and he's very confused. And we'll be able to talk about that when it comes to his character. But it's an interesting story because Jesus, even though he knows what he's going to do, he goes out of the way to test Philip. And I think this teaches us something about the character of God. It teaches us that sometimes God will ask us questions that he already knows the answers to. And he might put us in situations that are meant specifically to test us, and we shouldn't think that those testify against him, right? I think a lot of the times we face situations in life where we start thinking, oh my gosh, is God actually in control? Yes, he is in control. Sometimes he's just testing you to see how you respond and to see whether or not you have as much faith in him as you believe. Really, it seems like Philip's proper response would have been to respond as Ezekiel did whenever God asks him, when the whole Valley of Dry Bones story in Ezekiel, if you go read that, God asks him, I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing. It says something along the lines of like, can these bones come to life again? Something like that. And Ezekiel responds and says, Lord, you know. So he kind of wisely says, I have no idea, but God, you know the answer. It seems like that would have been the proper response from Philip. He should have turned to Jesus when Jesus said, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? It seems like Philip should have responded, Lord, you know. He's like, I have no idea, but I bet you have a solution. But instead he kind of doesn't. Instead, he's like very practical. He's like, I don't think we have enough money for that, Jesus. I mean, there's 5,000 men plus women and children. We're talking about like maybe 15, 20,000 people. We're just 12 dudes and a rabbi walking around. We don't have much money. I don't think we can afford this. And so Philip's very practical minded, right? A third key moment is telling Andrew about Greeks who wanted to see Jesus. This is in John chapter 12, another very interesting passage. All the things that we see with Philip, they're very strange passages where it's like you just want to sit on it and be like, what just happened? But John chapter 12, starting verse 20, we read this. Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there will my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. And so once again, very interesting story, because basically what we have is we have these Greek people who come to Philip and they're like, hey, we want to see Jesus. Philip, he doesn't know what to do. He's like, I'll take you to Andrew. Andrew doesn't know what to do either, but Andrew and Philip, they go to Jesus and they mention the Greeks. Jesus doesn't even seem to acknowledge the Greeks, and he just starts preaching about something totally different. And you have to be like, you got to wrestle. When you get to that passage, you have to wrestle through, why does Jesus do this? But the key thing to me here is, once again, look, Philip and Andrew side by side, and it specifically mentions that because Philip was from Bethsaida, the Greeks came to him. So it could be that maybe the Greeks knew Philip from Bethsaida. Maybe they had traveled down to Jerusalem and they were like, oh yeah, we know you. We'll come to you and we want to see Jesus. And then Philip took him to Andrew. This could be maybe Philip and Andrew were the only ones who spoke Greek. It could be because they are the only ones who have Greek names, and so they're the ones interacting with these Greeks. We don't really know, but ultimately it seems like they're unsure as to whether or not Jesus will even receive Greek people to talk to them. Once again, this will be interesting when we talk about Philip's character. But it's a very strange story. It's very strange, but we also see, I think, the humility of Philip here, because rather than just immediately going to Jesus, he kind of like goes to Andrew. He's like, hey, what do you think? Like, so he's kind of asking for like a second opinion, and then they both go to Jesus together. So once again, very interesting. One more key moment that we have from Philip here, and this is the last time we hear about him in the Gospel of John, is requesting that Jesus show them the Father. This specifically comes in verse 8 of chapter 14, but I'm going to start in verse 1 because this is a very famous passage, and, I want to give it credit. The context of John chapter 14 is that the disciples have gathered at the Last Supper, and Jesus has been preaching to them, right? He's been teaching them what's called the Last Supper discourse, John chapters 13 through 17. Basically, we start in the Last Supper, and eventually Jesus gets up, and they all start heading towards the Mount of Olives. And throughout this, Jesus is teaching. And in John chapter 14, he has just told them that he's going to be leaving, right? And he says, I give a new commandment to you. Love one another. As I have loved you, love one another. And he says, I'm going to be leaving. I'm going to be leaving. I'm going to be leaving. And then you can imagine that the disciples would be very scared at this moment. They would be terrified. They've spent 3.5 years following Jesus, and now he says he's going to leave. And they don't know what to do. And he says that they're going to be facing suffering and stuff. That's what he's going to get to later on in this chapter, in chapter 15 and 16. But he says he's leaving, and they're scared and they're troubled. And so he says this in verse 1. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. So what we've seen so far in this story is that Jesus says, hey guys, I know I said I'm leaving. I don't want you to be scared. And what he does is he starts invoking marriage imagery. He says that he's going off to his Father's house to prepare a place for his bride. That's what the marriage customs would have been back at that time period. Usually, once the two people got betrothed, the man would go build a house for his bride, and sometimes that house would be connected to his father's house, depending on how wealthy the dad was and stuff like that. And so Jesus used this imagery, and he says, I'm going away. I'm going to prepare a place for my bride, and I'm going to come back for you, and I will bring you to me. And then Thomas is like, we don't know how to get there. What's the way? Because they're very confused. They don't seem to understand that he's talking spiritually here. I mean, they do to an extent, because they know that he can't be talking about his literal father, because his physical father seems to be dead. Well, not physical father. His stepdad, Joseph, he was dead at this time period, it seems. And so they're very confused. And they're saying, okay, Jesus, we don't know where you're going, and we don't know the way. What are you talking about? And that's when Jesus says those famous words, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. If you want to be with the Father, you gotta go through me. He's saying the only way to dwell in my Father's house, the only way to become my bride, is by placing your faith in me. There's no map that will show you go left, right, left, right, left, 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 right. You can't do that to get to heaven. You can't work your way there. He says, if you want to go, it's got to be through me. If you want to see the Father, it's got to be through me. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. So he reassures the apostles. He says, y'all do have me, right? He says, y'all have believed. And because y'all have believed, y'all have known him and y'all have seen him. Y'all have known the Father and y'all have seen the Father. And so this is where Philip is going to speak up, starting in verse 8. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father and it's enough for us. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves. And so Philip seems to be misunderstanding Jesus once again. The disciples, they were misunderstanding what Jesus was saying till the very end. Literally, right before his ascension, they're still very confused. Thank God for the Holy Spirit descending. But Jesus says, because you know me, you have known the Father and you've seen him. And they're like, we've seen the Father. They know he's talking about God at this point. And Philip, he's like, show us the Father and that'll be enough for us. Just let us see the Father. It's very much like Moses requesting to see God. But God says, like, you can't see me, Moses. I'm too glorious. But Jesus doesn't respond in that way. He says, Philip, you've already seen him. I am the image of the Father. Those who have seen me have seen the Father. Do you not know me? It seems like Jesus is rebuking him. Jesus is saying, Philip, you've been with me this long and you don't recognize the fact that I am the perfect embodiment of my Father. I live for his glory. I live to proclaim him. Philip, have you been with me so long and you don't get it? So it's kind of sad, but once again, it kind of ties in with these previous things we've seen of Philip here. He's a very practical guy, right? He's thinking very literally. He does not seem to understand the deeper truths that Jesus is going for quite yet. But he does understand one thing really well. Come and see. He does seem to understand that Jesus will live up to whatever he has said. And so even if he doesn't understand what Jesus is saying, he knows that Jesus is true. Let's move on. Let's talk about Philip's character. I like that picture. This is whenever Philip first met Jesus in the season 2, episode 2. The first thing we know about Philip's character is that he was inviting and genuine. This is something that we do see when it was encountered Nathanael, when he says, come and see. He's inviting first and foremost because the first thing he does, he says, hey, come on. Come with me. There's an invitation there. But he's also very genuine in the fact that he's not trying to hide anything about who Jesus is. He's not trying to defend Jesus in a way where he's trying to frame him under the best light. He's not denying that Jesus came from Nazareth. He's just saying very genuinely, this is who Jesus is. Take him or leave him. Come and see. I like that about Philip. He's very straightforward. He just says what he's thinking. And I think that's something that we need to learn as well. I think a lot of the times, even in our churches, we change the gospel to try to make it appealing to people. We change it. We change our view of Jesus to make him as appealing as possible to others. I don't think we should do that. I think we should be people of truth, and that we should give people the unfiltered gospel, the unfiltered, authentic Jesus. I think that's important. Philip understood that. He wasn't trying to put Jesus under the best light. He wasn't trying to put him under a bad light either. He was just saying, this is who Jesus is, take him or leave him. He was genuine. He's like, come and see. If being from Nazareth is a deal breaker for you, too bad. But if you're willing to give him a chance, come on. I think that's how we should respond to people. I think we should invite them to come follow Jesus, and we should be genuine with that invitation. We shouldn't try to coerce them into it by saying, oh, we don't want to present the gospel as a get out of hell free card. We don't want to present the gospel as a get into heaven for free card. We want to present the gospel as an opportunity for a sinful people to be restored into union with their Creator and to once again be able to worship the God who is worthy of worship. Do they get free from hell? Yes. Do they get into heaven for free? Yes. But that's not the goal. The goal is to get them to come to Jesus, to come and see Jesus. That's got to be how we frame the gospel. We don't want to just make it emotional appeals. We don't want to make it just self-serving. We want to make it so that when people come to Jesus, they're coming to Jesus. They're not coming to serve themselves. They're coming to him. So we need to be invitational. We need to be genuine, just like Philip. Another thing we see is that he's practical and logical. This is what we saw in John chapter 6. Whenever Jesus says, how are we going to feed these people? And Philip's like, I have no idea whatsoever. He was unable to fathom how to provide bread for so many people, attempting to calculate how much it would cost. I think there is a time to be practical and logical. I think that I myself am, when it comes to how I think, I studied engineering for like 6 years of my life. I think I have a very practical and logical mind. But I think sometimes that comes to bite me in the butt a little bit. And I think it did with Philip here as well. Because I think sometimes we need to allow for some mystery, and we need to allow ourselves to trust in God. And sometimes when we're being purely practical and purely logical and purely rational, we're setting aside that extra room for faith. We're trusting in our understanding of the world. And rather, we need to be able to rely on what God has revealed to us in the world, right? We need to be able to rely on that. We need to trust in that because he has created this world of order for us to be able to pick up on basic principles and truths. But we also need to realize that our God is somebody who can overcome the principles of this world, who can overcome and surpass the rules that he himself created. Yes, he created the law of gravity, but if he wants to, he can have a man ascend up to heaven, right? And so we have to understand that God can surpass these things. Yes, he has made it so that all men die, but he has the power of resurrection. So we need to be practical and logical in life, but we also need to allow room for God to be God. And that's something that Philip needed to learn, and I think he did learn that by the end. But we need to learn that as well. I'm a very practical and logical person, but I need to constantly fight to allow God to do the miraculous and to allow God to do things that I would not expect or that aren't necessarily practical or logical. Third thing is that we see is that he is humble and a bit hesitant. This is what we saw in the story between him and Andrew whenever they were bringing the Greeks to Jesus. He's humble in his willingness to go and find Andrew, but he's also hesitant because he doesn't seem to understand whether or not they should bring the Greeks to Jesus. So he's humble and is willing to ask for a second opinion. He shows humility in his willingness to go ask for a second opinion, but he also shows hesitancy in that because really he should have just brought them straight to Jesus, probably. Ironically, Andrew and Philip, both of whom were eagerly willing to bring their fellow Jews to Jesus in chapter 1, are both hesitant and unsure in this chapter as to whether or not Jesus would receive Gentiles. Right? So this is interesting because in chapter 1, Andrew, he went and found Simon, and he might have even went and found Philip, but those were fellow Jews. Philip went and found Nathanael, a fellow Jew, and they immediately brought these guys to Jesus. But when it comes to Greeks, they're like, I don't know. This does show a little bit of the prejudice at that time period, but I think it's understandable if you get that culture and if you understand who the Jews were. The early church really struggled with this idea of Gentile inclusion. It was a rough deal. It's hard. I mean, I'm a Gentile, right? I'm so grateful they got it all figured out. But the early years of the church were people struggling to figure out, what is the role of Gentiles in the church? Are they allowed to be part of this, or is this just for Israel? I don't know. That's what people were wrestling with, and eventually God revealed to them that everybody's welcome, right? And that's amazing. Thank God for that. But this, I don't want to undersell. I don't want this to just be a negative thing on Philip. I think this was a cultural problem for the Jews and a religious problem for the Jews at that time period. And I think it was a legitimate one. I think we undersell it whenever we make it an easy issue. as a Jew at that time period, this would have been a very difficult thing to understand, specifically because Jesus was also doing something new, right? They'd say, okay, I know how maybe Gentiles relate to the old covenant, but Jesus, what are you doing? Like, how does this relate? And so we see he's humble and he's hesitant, and I'm not saying that the hesitancy is a good thing, but it's an understandable thing that we can empathize with. Fourthly, we see that he was curious, confused, and seeking. And these are all various different things. And this comes from the last account that we just read, which is whenever he says, let us see the Father, and that'll be enough for us. And so he has a genuine desire to see God, but he's confused as to what Jesus means by his teachings, right? He's like, yeah, I want to see the Father. But he doesn't get that Jesus has already said, you have already seen him. Jesus spoke in the past tense and said, you have known him and you have seen him. I'm going to read a few quotes from other scholars as to how to interpret this passage, because it's a strange one to me. Like, this is the one where it's like Philip's response is kind of strange. Thomas's response prior to that is also very strange. But I'm going to start with D.A. Carson, who I've quoted before. Then I'm going to talk about Sean McDowell, and then I'm going to quote Merrill C. Tenney. So D.A. Carson says this. This is once again in his commentary on the Gospel of John. Philip thus joins the queue of human beings through the ages who have rightly understood that there can be no higher experience, no greater good than seeing God as he is, in unimaginable splendor and transcendent glory. We have been made in his image, and however much we have defaced that image, we still yearn for the visio Dei, the vision of God. And so he is actually talking about the positive traits of Philip here. He's saying that Philip recognizes, man, I want to see God. Once again, kind of like how I was talking about with Moses, where Moses is like, God, let me just see you. Or David in Psalm 27:4, which I quote all the time. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that shall I seek, to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of his temple. Oh wow, I just totally butchered it. The verse just kind of passed out of my head. Interesting. Okay. But David's desire is to dwell with God, is to be with God, to be in his presence. Philip gets that. He's curious, he's genuine, he's seeking, he's excited. He's like, I want to see God. Sean McDowell says this. His response characterizes the ill-informed and dull-witted nature of the apostles, who do not yet understand the full extent of who Jesus is. Philip wanted to see the Father with his physical eyes through some sort of theophany, as Moses experienced, but he failed to realize the far greater privilege he had personally been granted by being with Jesus. And so it's funny how you see the total polar opposite interpretations of this, but I think they're both correct. Because I think on one side, D.A. Carson is correct whenever he praises Philip for his request, because Philip wants to see God. But then I think Sean McDowell is also correct whenever he kind of rebukes Philip here a little bit. And he's like, I don't know. Because it shows that Philip, like the other disciples, they didn't understand what a gift they had in Jesus. They understood that Jesus was awesome. They understood Jesus was the Messiah, but they didn't seem to understand that Jesus was himself God in the flesh. They did not seem to get that until after the resurrection. And so it's kind of funny. Like, they're in the presence of God, and they're like, let us see God. And Jesus is like, I am God. Merrill Tenney says this. If Thomas was a skeptic, Philip was a realist. Having determined in his thinking that the Father of whom Jesus spoke must be the ultimate absolute, Philip demanded that he and his associates might see him. Philip was materialistic. Apparently, abstractions meant little to him. Nevertheless, he had a deep desire to experience God for himself. And so we get to see once again that practical and logical side of Philip coming out right here. Jesus is speaking spiritually about how they have seen the Father through him, and Philip's like, but I want to physically see the Father. And so you see that coming out again. John MacArthur, once again, 12 Ordinary Men, he says this about Philip, and this is him just generally summarizing Philip's person. It seems Philip was a classic process person. He was a facts and figures guy, a by-the-book, practical-minded, non-forward-thinking type of individual. He was the kind who tends to be a corporate killjoy, pessimistic, narrowly focused, sometimes missing the big picture, often obsessed with identifying reasons things can't be done, rather than finding ways to do them. He was predisposed to be a pragmatist and a cynic, and sometimes a defeatist, rather than a visionary. Once again, I think you can probably agree with me that John MacArthur might be exaggerating a little bit in regards to this, because I've already read to you, like so far in this video, we have already talked about every account that mentions Philip in the Gospels. I don't think we get that negative of a view of him. I think that really he's mainly basing it off of this one right here, I think that is where Philip comes across looking the most practical, the most negative. And I think MacArthur, I think he just kind of exaggerates it a bit. Like I said, I usually really like John MacArthur's stuff, but it seems like he was really fighting to create an entire book whenever he wrote that book, 12 Ordinary Men. Because it seems like he says, and this is consistent with a lot of them. I'm going to quote what he says because he has a lot of really good stuff in that book. I don't want to undersell that. But some of it does seem a little bit hyperbolic from what we can actually tell from the text of Scripture. So he has a very negative view of Philip that I don't think that we can necessarily hold to. He does say some other positive stuff in the book, but I just want to let you know to be careful with what scholarship you read, because sometimes even the most trustworthy scholars, you got to be kind of careful because they might overstate things a little bit. And that's why usually I will recommend books to you that I found like very, very helpful and not too biased. Because, I mean, we all have biases. I'm biased in many ways, as you probably tell in these videos, but I do want to try to be as honest with this as we possibly can. And so there's Philip's character. He's inviting and genuine, practical and logical, humble and hesitant, curious, confused, and seeking. That is who Philip is. Let's move on and let's start talking about Philip in Acts and the Epistles. And spoiler alert, we don't have a lot to say. That's because Philip is only mentioned once in the book of Acts, in chapter 1, verse 13, and he's never mentioned in the epistles. Chapter 1, verse 13, that is where it is listing out the list of the 12 apostles. Philip is only mentioned there. He's never mentioned again in the book of Acts. He's never mentioned again in the epistles. But there's one thing we do need to address. That is the confusion of the two Philips. And that is because as we go into our talk of traditions surrounding Philip, this is going to be especially important for us. So like I said at the beginning of this video, there are two Philips mentioned in the book of Acts. First off, there's Philip the Apostle in chapter 1. He's a member of the 12. This is the guy we've been talking about this entire video. He's the one who is the Philip throughout the Gospels, right? There's two Philips in the Gospels. There's Philip, member of the 12, and there's Philip, the Tetrarch, who is the guy who Caesarea Philippi is named after, right? Philip the Apostle is the one we've been talking about. There's another Philip introduced in the book of Acts, and he is actually much more prominent in this book. He is in chapters 6 through 8, and then he also makes an appearance in chapter 21 of the book of Acts. And this guy is a deacon appointed over the church in Jerusalem, who likewise had a successful ministry in Samaria. The way that this came about is that basically the early church was thriving. It was getting really good, really strong, really amazing, and what had to happen is that they had to appoint some other people. The apostles, the church basically had gotten so big that the apostles couldn't handle everything. And so what they did is they decided to appoint 7 deacons to kind of take the load off of them and help them out with some of the stuff. One of these deacons was named Stephen, and what we see in these chapters is that Stephen is going to become the first martyr for the Christian faith. But another one is a guy named Philip, and he is one of these deacons who's kind of helping take the load off the apostles. Philip is going to be prominent throughout the book of Acts. He's going to have all those stories, like I mentioned, with the Ethiopian eunuch, and he's going to do stuff in Samaria, all this stuff. And he's very prominent in that book. As a result of this, though, we've got two Philips, and confusion between these two Philips began as early as Papias in the 2nd century. We've talked about Papias quite a bit. His name might be pronounced Papias. I don't really care when it comes to pronunciations. I don't mind, so if you're going to get on to me about how to pronounce things, don't bother. But as early as the 2nd century, church traditions are getting these two guys confused, and this is going to make our discussion very, very difficult as we go into the traditions about Philip, because a lot of the times we just don't know who these traditions are talking about, if they're talking about Philip the Apostle or Philip the Evangelist. So basically, going forward, this is all we know. Basically, everything we've talked about so far is what we definitively know about Philip. As we go into traditions, we're just going to have to kind of conflate these two characters and make our best guesses as to which one is which, and be satisfied with the fact that we really just do not know. So we don't know which one's being referred to here in either one, but that's basically the reason I want to spend time on this, is just to explain to you where this confusion comes from. But let's move on. Let's talk about Philip according to tradition. First off, we're going to talk about travels and traditions. We don't have a lot to say about with Philip, and that's because, like I said, of all the videos that I've done so far, I think Philip has been the hardest to research because there's just so little we know about him, specifically because these two guys get confused. And because they get confused, it's hard to decide which ones, and so you just gotta give the bare minimum, because I want these videos to be what we can be fairly confident about these guys. I'm including speculations here and there, but I want it to be mainly the stuff we know. And as a result of that, there's just not going to be as much. And so travels and traditions. Firstly, while we have reason to believe that Philip engaged in missionary activity, and while there are many traditions listing out locations and stories regarding his missionary efforts, we don't know where exactly he traveled to. Early church traditions seem to agree that Philip ultimately ended up in the city of Hierapolis in modern-day Turkey, and we'll talk about that when we get to the traditions and whenever we get to his ultimate fate. But this is what Sean McDowell says in regards to the travels and traditions of Philip. He says this: one of the difficulties in tracing the missionary endeavors and fate of the Apostle Philip is the existence of Philip the evangelist in Acts, kind of like I already mentioned. Apparently a different figure than the apostle. Given the number of stories in Acts about Philip the evangelist, William Barclay concludes that more is known about him than about the apostle Philip. Most scholars conclude that both Philips were fused as one in later church tradition, although medieval authors do distinguish them. So that's just basically Sean McDowell kind of giving us a general conclusion about Philip. Because Philip the evangelist was so prominent in Acts, it seems like we have more stories about him in church tradition, and it seems like the early church kind of just molded the two together. In the Middle Ages, people finally were like, oh yeah, these are separate people, but by then you're so far removed from the original stories that you just don't know which ones are true, which ones are about Philip the evangelist, which are about Philip the apostle. It's kind of hard to backtrack here, right? This is the difficulty that a lot of people face when it comes to studying history in general, not just history of the early church. People have the same names, and it's like, oh boy, yikes. Nowadays, we have the benefit of having first names, middle names, last names. We have all these different things that can separate us. Back then, it's like Philip and Philip. We'll have the apostle and the evangelist. And so it made things very, very difficult. And so, in regards to his travels, we can say this. We have good reason to believe that Philip, like the other apostles, engaged in missionary activity beyond Jerusalem, but we simply don't know where. Some traditions have him ministering in Parthia, Athens, and Scythia. Some have him ministering in France. Some have him ministering among cannibals in various regions. Given how late most of these traditions develop, and given the fact that he is often mixed up with Philip the Evangelist, we simply don't have much to work with in regards to his missionary work. And so that's the unfortunate thing about Philip. We just don't have much to work off there. I mean, there's a lot to work off of. We just don't know if any of them being reliable. That's why I didn't even include a map in this one. Normally, I include like a map in these videos where I kind of highlight these places they traveled to. With Philip, we just don't know. I mean, literally, there are traditions for all these various different places, but a lot of those traditions are very late, and some of them don't specify the difference between Philip the Evangelist and Philip the Apostle. So we just don't know. I mean, he could have ministered in France. He could have ministered to some cannibals. He could have ministered all over the place. But we just have no way of knowing. The only place that we have a fair amount of certainty that he went to is Hierapolis. And so I'll include that. When it comes to traditions, there aren't many mainstream traditions regarding Philip. Of those that exist, most are either Gnostic or they have a relatively late date. And so Gnosticism was an early church heresy that kind of developed in the 2nd century. You kind of see the early traces of it in the 1st century, and it seems like some of the New Testament texts are even combating it, but it really developed in the 2nd century. And you have a lot of Gnostic gospels like the letter of Peter to Philip or all the apocryphal gospels that you'll hear people talking about, like the Da Vinci Code type stuff, which don't even get me started on that. But you'll have a lot of these Gnostic gospels that come up, and they'll tell you traditions about Philip, but they seem heavily embellished, and we don't know how much truth there is to them. And then a lot of the other traditions are very late dated, where it seems like sometimes some churches just wanted to have some sort of apostolic root, and so they just pick an apostle and be like, yeah, he ministered here. We don't know. We just don't know. And so I didn't feel comfortable listing out those traditions. I'm not even going to read a lot of them because they're just so late and they're so Gnostic that I don't put a lot of weight to them. Various traditions are detailed in the Acts of Philip, which is a 4th century text, but the legends are bizarre and do seem highly embellished. And so once again, we're going to kind of stick away from it. We are going to read a little bit from the Acts of Philip in just a second, but ultimately, I just don't feel as confident talking about Philip as I have about some of the other apostles. The other ones, it's a little bit easier to do this. I mean, we're going to see the same thing with Matthew whenever we get to him, because Matthew, as you'll know in the book of Acts, they have to replace Judas Iscariot with another apostle, and the person they choose is a guy named Matthias. And it seems like early traditions kind of mixed up Matthew and Matthias as well because their names were so similar. And we see this also with Big James and Little James. Because people had similar names, it's just very difficult. And so a lot of the traditions we have, they're very late, very bizarre, very seemingly embellished. So you're just kind of working with what you got. And so this is all we've got with travels and traditions when it comes to Philip. We don't have anything as much as we do with the other apostles. Let's talk about the fate of Philip. What you'll see here is a famous painting. Maybe. I don't know how famous it is. I like studying art, so it's famous to me. This is a painting of Philip being raised up for crucifixion. And so you're going to be thinking, oh, so David, Philip must have been crucified. Hold on. The earliest traditions say that Philip died in Hierapolis, but none mention how he died. This is the issue we have once again. So we do have early traditions regarding Philip in Hierapolis, but none of them actually mention specifically how he died. We have Papias and Polycrates, or Polycrates, I don't care how to pronounce it. Both of these are people writing in the 2nd century, but they don't mention how he died. They just mention that he was in Hierapolis. Papias, he says this is Eusebius in his book Church History, writing in the 4th century. He's quoting Papias in the 2nd century. Papias says that Philip the apostle dwelt in Hierapolis with his daughters, and that has been already stated earlier on in the text, right? So Papias mentions that Philip had some daughters, and they were both living in Hierapolis. The question is whether or not this Philip is Philip the apostle or Philip the evangelist, because like I said, by the 2nd century, they were already getting these two guys confused. It could go either way. Either this is Philip the apostle or Philip the evangelist. I believe in the book of Acts, we do know that Philip the evangelist had daughters. That makes things even murkier. But we just don't know. It does seem like Papias is referring to Philip the apostle here, though, and so we have good reason to think that he ended up in Hierapolis. Polycrates, he's also writing in the 2nd century. He says this, "For in Asia also great lights have fallen asleep, which shall rise again on the last day, at the coming of the Lord, when he shall come with glory from heaven and shall seek out all the saints. Among these are Philip, one of the 12 apostles, who sleeps in Hierapolis, and his 2 aged virgin daughters, and another daughter who lived in the Holy Spirit and now rests at Ephesus." And then he goes on to talk about how the apostle John was also in Ephesus. And so right here, Polycrates specifically goes out of the way to specify that this is Philip the apostle, and he's with his daughters in Hierapolis. And so both of these guys are writing in the 2nd century. They both claim that Philip died in Hierapolis, but neither of them mention how he died. They never mention a specific means of death. So now we have to talk about, how do we think Philip died? Of the apostles, we probably know the least about Philip's fate. I know, I'm sorry. Later traditions provide various possibilities regarding his death, 3 of which include some manner of crucifixion, and 1 of which includes dying of natural causes at the age of 87. And there are more additional martyrdom accounts in addition to this, but I just tried to include the earliest ones, and as you can see, they're still fairly late. 4th century, 7th century, 7th century. These are far later than I am typically comfortable with quoting, but we just have so little to work on with Philip that I tried to include what I could, right? So, one tradition says that he was crucified upside down. That seems to be a common one with the apostles. It seems like when in doubt, the people writing the traditions were like, let's just have him be crucified upside down. Some said that he was stoned and crucified. Some say that he was crucified, and then some say that he died of natural causes. And so basically it seems like he was either crucified or he died of natural causes, or you could go find another tradition that says something else. Ultimately, we just don't know. But I thought I would read some of those accounts to you just so that you can see what type of stuff we're working with. So we're going to start off talking about his possible martyrdom, and we're going to talk about these 3 right there. Let's start with the Acts of Philip, where we read about Philip being crucified upside down, and this comes from the 4th century. The context behind this passage is that the proconsul Trianos had Philip and Bartholomew tortured for leading his wife away from idol worship. So one thing that's really cool about some of the early traditions is that we have Philip and Bartholomew ministering alongside one another. And this gives us, once again, reason to think that Bartholomew might have been Nathaniel, because Philip and Nathaniel have a close friendship in John chapter 1. And so some of the early traditions do have Philip and Bartholomew ministering with one another, and that gives us evidence to think that these traditions are specifically about Philip the apostle. But in this story, Philip and Bartholomew have been wandering around, they've been ministering, and the proconsul Tyrannus is punishing them. We read this. "And he ordered Philip to be hanged, and his ankles to be pierced, and to bring also iron hooks, and his heels also to be driven through, and to be hanged head downwards opposite the temple on a certain tree. And stretch out Bartholomew opposite Philip, having nailed his hands on the wall to the gate of the temple. Yikes, right? So basically this guy, he has Philip and Bartholomew both hanged, both pierced. They're both getting ready to die. Now what happens is that the Apostle John suddenly shows up. Cool, little cameo appearance. Apostle John shows up and people try to harm them, causing Philip to lash out in anger and curse them, which leads to a massive earthquake that swallows basically everything. And then God appears to Philip and rebukes him for lashing out in anger and bars him from paradise for 40 days. That was basically my one paragraph summary of what happens there, because this is a very extended account. Like I said, this is the 4th century. It's probably highly embellished. We have reason to think this is probably not true. It just seems like it's a folk tale at this point. But basically the Apostle John comes, he sees Philip, and he's like, oh my gosh, dude, what's going on? And some people try to harm John. And so Philip gets so mad at them that he curses them, and it causes this huge earthquake. And God literally speaks to Philip and is like, dude, you can't do that, man. And Philip repents. But God says that because of this, whenever he dies, he's going to be barred from heaven for 40 days. Which, first and foremost, just doesn't seem how God works, right? God does not seem to do stuff like that. It's almost like a purgatory thing. I don't know. I don't necessarily think that God functions in that way. Once again, it seems highly embellished. But then the story picks back up. And when the multitude had come up, having looked upon Philip hanging head downwards, they lamented with a great lamentation. And some of the faithful ran up to take down Philip and take him off the iron grapnels and the hooks out of his ankles. But Philip said, do not, my children, do not come near me on account of this, for thus shall be my end. And when Philip had finished this announcement, he said to them, loose Bartholomew. And having gone up, they loosed him. And so basically, despite the fact that Philip is being crucified upside down, some people really like Philip. And they do not like this has happened. And they get ready to basically launch this attack to come free him. But Philip says, no, I've received word from the Lord that this is how I should die. However, it's not Bartholomew's time yet. So go and free Bartholomew so that he can live on. And so that's exactly what they do. They go and free Bartholomew, but they allow Philip to stay there hanging upside down on the cross because he has agreed that his time has come. The text continues. And Philip, having said these things, prayed thus. And now we're going to get this very extended, very poetic prayer from Philip. O Lord Jesus Christ, Father of the ages, King of the light, who hast made us wise in your wisdom, and hast given us your understanding, and hast bestowed upon us the counsel of your goodness, who hast never at any time left us. You are he who takes away the disease of those who flee to you for refuge. You are the Son of the living God, who has given us presence of wisdom, who has given us signs and wonders, who has turned those who have gone astray, who crowns those who have overcome the adversary, you excellent judge. Come now, Jesus, and give me the everlasting crown of victory against every adverse dominion and power, and do not let their dark air hide me when I shall cross the waters of fire and all the abyss. O my Lord Jesus Christ, let not the enemy have ground to accuse me at your tribunal, but put on me your glorious robe, your seal of light that ever shines, until I shall pass by all the powers of the world and the wicked dragon that lies in wait for us. Now therefore, my Lord Jesus Christ, make me meet you in the air, having forgiven me the recompense which I recompense to my enemies, and transform the form of my body into angelic glory, and give me rest in your blessedness. And let me receive the promise from which you have promised to your saints to everlasting. So basically, Philip's hanging upside down. He prays this majestic, poetic prayer. Like I said, it seems highly embellished. I don't think a person hanging from a cross would be able to say such a long thing. But then we read this. And having thus spoken, Philip gave up the ghost. And while all the multitudes were looking upon him and weeping and saying, the life of this spirit has been accomplished in peace. And they said the Amen. Right? And so this is the very poetic and long extended account of Philip's death. He's hanging on a cross upside down. He prays this majestic prayer up to heaven, and then he releases his spirit. And the people mourn his death, but they say it was a life well lived. Very interesting story, but like I said, probably highly embellished, probably not legit. But that's an example of him being crucified upside down. I will read one more example of him being crucified. This comes from the Irish Biblical Apocrypha. And I'm just going to be honest, a lot of these, I would read you more accounts. I just had a tough time finding them. It is hard to find this stuff. And some of the ancient accounts, they just haven't been translated to English yet. and I'm not going to go through the trouble of translating that stuff. But from the Irish Biblical Apocrypha, we read this. Thereupon the people and priests ordered that the apostle should be crucified, since they failed to inflict any other death on him. A certain wicked, cruel man among them came forward and placed a deadly noose around the apostle's neck, and they hanged him then, after he had endured much pain, insult, and scourging like his master Jesus. Hierapolis then is the name of the city in which Philip the apostle was crucified. Great splendor and ministering angels were seen around all the gallows when Philip expired, and the angels placed the soul of the apostle in the mansion of the kingdom of heaven, in the glory of the angels, after the attainment of the crown of martyrdom. So earlier in the account, he was stoned, and now it seems like a noose is placed around his neck, and then he's crucified, and then he dies. And this all happens in Hierapolis. So once again, we have a consistent account that he's in Hierapolis. That's the consistent thing. He's always in Hierapolis. That seems to be legit. The rest of it, though, we just don't know. But this one also hasn't been crucified. Then, last one I'm going to read. I'm not actually going to read the account because I couldn't find it. All I could find was a summary of the account. Maybe because the account itself hasn't been translated to English. I don't know. Or actually, it's probably because you had to pay a lot of money for the account, now that I'm thinking about it. And I didn't feel like paying money to buy it, so I didn't. But this last one I'm going to read is from the Apostolic Acts of Abdius. I don't know the date of this, but this is one that is, it's a fairly early one, I guess, that presents him as dying of natural causes in Hierapolis at the age of 87. And according to the Apostolic Acts of Abdius in Book 10, this is what we read about Philip. Philip goes to Scythia 20 years after the Ascension, this is around AD 50, where he performs many miracles. After establishing a church there over the course of a year, he returns to Hierapolis, where he takes on the Ebionite heresy and has 2 daughters who likewise convert many people. A week before his death, he calls the clergy together to encourage them. Then he dies peacefully at the age 87 in Hierapolis. A few years later, his daughters likewise die and are buried to his right and to his left. And so basically, that account, if anything, I would say that might even be more legit, because it seems like later traditions began to embellish the accounts to where all the apostles were dying martyrs' deaths. And so it would seem to me that this is actually probably one of the more reliable ones, just because it has him dying a peaceful death. And so they wouldn't have anything to gain from embellishing this, right? But I don't know either way. And really, we can't say. But in this account, he's ministering everywhere. He goes to Hierapolis. He has some daughters. They minister places. And then finally, he gathers people together. He prays with them. They celebrate the Lord. And then he dies peacefully at the age of 87. And so he doesn't die a martyr's death at all. And the reason why I include this stuff is because a lot of the times with the apostles, we overstate our case. We say all the apostles died a martyr's death except for John, and he died peacefully. That is possible. We do at least, for sure, have martyrdom accounts of all the apostles except for John. And with John, we do actually have accounts, like we talked about, of him being, where people attempted to martyr him, and it's always possible that he also died a martyr's death. We just don't know. I don't want us to overstate our cases, and so what I want us to do is I want us to examine these and just come to the most reasonable conclusions we can. And so these are our conclusions. This all being said, we don't have a definitive date or cause of death for Philip. He could have died in AD 50, he could have died in AD 90, we just don't know. We have evidence of him being martyred. We have evidence of him dying a natural death at 87. We just really do not know. We just don't. And so these are Sean McDowell's conclusions. Once again, this comes from The Fate of the Apostles, which is, without a doubt, my favorite book covering this stuff. It is the most in-depth, the most scholarly, the most unbiased stuff I could find. He concludes this. The fact that Philip engaged in missionary work outside Jerusalem is very probably true, because that seems to be consistent with all of the apostles. It seems like they all did that, and we don't have any accounts that say, any extra biblical accounts that say that he stayed in Jerusalem. We do have a bunch of traditions saying that he traveled all over, and so it's very probably true that he did go outside of Jerusalem. The fact that he experienced martyrdom, it's as plausible as not. It could go either way. He might have died a martyr's death. He might not have. We have evidence for both, and really, we just can't say. We can't say, and so I think as Christians, since our main goal is truth, we need to admit that. I think that we shouldn't overstate our case. I know it might make us sound good, and it might bolster our faith to think that all the apostles died the martyrs' deaths, but they don't have to die martyrs' deaths for Christianity to be true. We have evidence that a lot of them did. We know that Paul died a martyr's death. We know that Peter died a martyr's death. We know that a lot of these guys, we have good reason to think that they did die martyrs' deaths. But we don't want to overstate it, right? We want to be people of truth. We don't want to just tell people what we think sounds good, because that actually weakens our case, because that actually means that we're doing the opposite of what Philip wants, right? Philip, he's the guy who says, come and see. He says, you know what, just come look at it, face value, uncensored, see who Jesus is, and believe in him. So whenever we actually overstate the case, what we're doing is we're doing the opposite of what Philip did. We are kind of censoring certain things, we're hiding facts away, and we're telling people, oh, let me present Christianity under the best light, and now let's see if you believe. Well, now they're not believing in Christianity, they're believing in your false presentation of Christianity. Let's just tell people the truth. We don't need Philip to have died a martyr's death for Christianity to be true. What we need for Christianity to be true, according to 1 Corinthians 15, is for Jesus to have resurrected from the dead. If Jesus resurrected from the dead, then Christianity is true. Jesus is God. Worthy is his name. Everything he has said he will do will come to pass. That's what we need. We don't need Philip to die a martyr's death. So whether he did or didn't, it doesn't really matter. And so I just want to encourage you, don't overstate your case. Let's be people of truth. Truth is key to the life and witness of a Christian. And so I'm going to encourage you with that. And that being said, there's our video on Philip. There are 5 disciples, 5 apostles down. Next, we are going to be talking about Nathaniel/Bartholomew, and we might have to address whether or not those are the same people. And I am very excited to do that one. I've already been doing the research on it. I am already almost done working on it, and I'm excited to get that to y'all as soon as I possibly can. I'm trying to upload these every Sunday. I might eventually have to start putting some breaks in there, but if I can keep this up, I will. Thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to like it, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, share it with all your friends, comment below, let me know what you thought about it, let me know if you have any questions, and also, if you want this shirt, he must increase, I must decrease. It's John chapter 3, verse 30, and it says, now let's be honest on the back. You can get that at nowletsbehonest.com. Go to the store button, and you'll be able to find this, and you'll be able to buy it. Go wear it, and start conversations about Jesus. And keep this in mind. He must increase, I must decrease. It's not about us. It's about him and his glory. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it. I can't wait to see y'all next time. I can't wait to interact with you in the comments. Until then, my name's David. This is Now Let's Be Honest About Movies. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. I'll see y'all later. Bye.
Father, if it be possible, remove this cup from me. Father, I'm so scared, and I need your comfort.